Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on the program. Mourners from around the world paid their respects to former U.S. President George H.W. Bush. Can today's leaders take a page out of his book? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Former U.S. President George H.W. Bush passed away last Friday at the age of 94. Today, flags flew at half-mast in Washington as his body lies in state in the U.S. Capitol. His funeral will take place on Wednesday morning. Bush assumed office in 1989 to see out the end of America's Cold War standoff with the former Soviet Union, while he also routed Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army from Kuwait in the early 1990s. He was the father of President George W. Bush, who served 2 terms in the White House. To know more about his legacy, particularly his stories with China, take a look at this.
George Herbert Walker Bush became the 41st U.S. president in 1989. Just as a wave of revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe caused the Cold War framework to crumble. As a former CIA chief and U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, he brought with him a deep knowledge of foreign affairs, which he honed in the mid-1970s as chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing. It was there he formed a personal attachment to China, meeting with its people and its leadership. And so for his first foreign trip as U.S. president, Bush headed back to Beijing, meeting with Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders. He told CCTV reporters at the time, quote, "The growing relationship between China and the United States is vital to my country, and I hope it will benefit the people in China." In his book, 41, A Portrait of My Father, the president's son, George W. Bush, wrote of how his dad tried to live out a principled and restrained style of leadership.
Preach the sermon daily, and if necessary, use words. Summarizes the man.
In 1990, President Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev forged an agreement on the U.S.-Soviet Chemical Weapons Accord and the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty known as START, setting in motion an unprecedented reduction of nuclear arsenals for both nations. But Bush 41 was still fighting a domestic perception gained on the campaign trail, that of a wealthy, privileged bureaucrat who was soft. Panama would be his first test. In December 1989, he ordered more than 27,000 U.S. troops to invade Panama to depose General Manuel Noriega, who was said to be threatening the security of Americans living there. Hundreds of Panamanians died. But his greatest military test came when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. Bush rallied 34 nations to send hundreds of thousands of troops to Iraq, forming Operation Desert Storm. They launched an air war, followed by a brief ground assault, ending in a decisive victory for the coalition. A year later, Bush ran for re-election, but a faltering economy and a broken promise on preventing tax hikes led to his loss to Democrat Bill Clinton in 1992. It was that loss that emboldened 2 of his sons to run for public office. Bush 41's presidency spawned an American political dynasty that continues to this day.
For more on George H.W. Bush's legacy, particularly the characteristics of leaders of his time, with us in our Beijing studio, Victor Gao Zhikai, current affairs commentator and former translator to the Chinese top leadership. And also in Philadelphia, we have Michael Johns, who is a former White House speechwriter to President George H.W. Bush. In Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, professor of political science of the University of Iowa. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you first, Mr. Johns. One of the questions people have been thinking about is why this time so strong reactions around the world toward the pass away of this great man. Is it about him alone, or is it about rethinking of the qualities of leadership today?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, one of the great attributes of President George H.W. Bush was he forged many close relationships, and he kept up with those relationships. He was a great letter writer, a great what I would call almost a master of the small gesture. And many people developed a great fondness, including heads of state that he interacted with throughout his career. I think you're also right that there was a reflection over the last few days, and I think it'll hopefully continue, of an era in American politics when we had clearly a bipartisan divide, but it wasn't quite as hardened and bitter as it's become today. And President Bush, in many respects, reflected a approach that was designed to bring about political cohesiveness and unity. He wasn't always successful in that because it was difficult, but it was an aspiration of his. And it's, you know, become a very different political culture in the United States today, with each party really
That's right.
seeking political leverage over the other and exploiting any perceived weaknesses, and much more difficult.
Professor Hagel, there has been a lot of debate about what is that kind of right balance about that man, you know, about civility and also humbleness, but at the same time ambitious, with the ego strong enough for his country. How do you see that balance?
Well, I think you're right there, and that there is a balance there that we aren't seeing in the past several years. That, as was indicated, that we see a hardening of the parties for a variety of reasons. But this isn't something that just happened all at once. That it's been a gradual change since the 90s, since President George H.W. Bush was in office. And we just drifted away from those sorts of things. And part of it may be that you have just a different generation. As people have indicated, that Bush 41 was the last of the people that had been sort of part of World War II in one way or another, himself a veteran, of course, and just it's a different time, a different approach to things, aside from the fact of Bush 41's personal differences, where he was a more congenial kind of person. He had that diplomatic background and just took a different approach to leadership than what we see in more recent presidents.
Of course, the so-called Great Generation, as the Americans call it, is of the George H.W. Bush's generation. But Mr. Gao, in China, of course, many Chinese remember him dearly and even call him a statesman. That's an old friend of China. That's quite a top level title anyone could get in terms of friendship with Chinese people. And he did have it, and he is still having it. And Mr. Gao, what is making him standing out among all the other leaders, including all the other presidents of the U.S. history, to have this very unique relationship with China?
Well, on today, when the state funeral is about to start for President George H.W. Bush in the United States, people here in China, leaders as well as civilians, we also mourn the death of President Bush. Why? Because he probably was the President of the United States best known to China, because he spent years as the U.S. envoy here to China. He worked very closely with many Chinese leaders, starting from Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, and you name it. And then when he was vice president for 8 years and president for 4 years, and later when his son was president for 8 years in the White House, President George H.W. Bush always took care of nurturing and developing China-U.S. friendship and goodwill, even in most difficult times. In 1989, when he went back to the United States from his state visit to China, after what happened in Beijing, he still took a lot of care. He sent his National Security Advisor, General Scowcroft, on a secret mission to China, which kept open the dialogue between the Chinese leadership and the American leader, and he contributed so much over the years and decades to China-U.S. friendship. And I think we mourn him, and we will always keep in mind his great contribution for China-U.S. relations, especially when relations between the two countries are at a very, very difficult time, and we need to recall the great things that President Bush did to nurture and grow China-U.S. relations, and we hope China-U.S. relations can be back on the normal and mutually beneficial growth.
Of course, we are at a very different stage now when it comes to where China is, where the United States is. But Mr. Johns, there's always inspiration we can draw from, you know, the visionary thinking and strategic minds of the generation of leaders from, for example, George H.W. Bush's times. Mr. Johns, about China policy, certainly he sees the significance of it and enough common ground.
Yeah, I think the fact that President Bush had spent those 14 months in Beijing as the envoy clearly did shape his understanding of China as a very important nation in the world, and an understanding that our relationship with China is very important in all respects, strategically, economically, culturally, and I do believe that he championed the idea of close relationships between the U.S. and Beijing. And by the way, I don't think there's really anyone in American leadership today who necessarily disagrees with that. The disagreements now have evolved into ones over policy. And, you know, it's important to remember we have our own policy differences even in the United States.
That's
so
right.
It shouldn't be terribly surprising that we have them with powerful nations of the world like
Beautifully
China.
said, Mr. Johns. That's why I want to follow up a little bit about it. And that generations of leaders, for example, those from Washington, were intelligent enough and respectful enough in recognize that some of the issues within the relationship should not be able to hijack the overall nature of the relationship and the potential of the relationship. Some say this has a lot to do with his generations, past. For example, they experienced the war. They knew what war is about, and they knew how some of the biggest players in the world had to work together. Mr. Johns, others say, well, it probably is his own personal approach and knowledge of China. Mr. Johns, how should we understand this?
I think you have to appreciate that President George H.W. Bush, on his 18th birthday, enrolled in the U.S. military. He served in World War II. He was shot down over the Pacific. He very nearly died. He was rescued. Others who were shot down were in fact killed. And in fact, in the 4 hours roughly that he spent in the Pacific while holding onto a raft before he was actually saved, he prayed and he pondered his role, and if he would be saved, how he would essentially spend the rest of his life. And he didn't like to talk very openly about that. As a White House speechwriter, many of us sort of encouraged him to speak more openly about World War II, and because it seemed to be important, and it's clearly distinguished him, especially in that 1992 presidential race. But I think, as you correctly say, he was more reserved. He was a man structured on values and humility. And those are still some values that many of us, me included, I think, like to see restored into U.S. leadership. They served America well. And anyone who looked at Bob Dole, the former U.S. Senator of Kansas, who was the majority leader, get out of his wheelchair yesterday, also a veteran, to salute President Bush's coffin yesterday, had to be moved by that generation and its impact.
Yeah, it always takes the two to tango, Professor Hagel. One has to say also the generations of leaders in China, for example, in some of the other countries as well, together with George H.W. Bush, be able to see the longer picture, the bigger picture as well. So, Mr. Hagel, much food for thoughts for the current generations of leaders around the world?
It is food for thought. I'm not sure that they will be able to consume it, though, to carry the analogy forward. Again, when you have those, as Mr. Johns was describing, the sort of defining moments in a person's life that revolve around things like a world war and personal danger and things of that nature, that really changes your view. And as you folks have indicated, that in terms of being able to get along with other nations, other people, whatever it happens to be, leaders of the other party, in ways that serve us for the long term, that you tend to then downplay some of the short-term differences that may occasionally divide us. Well, today it doesn't seem that we're able to get past that, here in the United States at least, that we tend to fight over a lot of little things that then tend to perhaps destroy that long-term relationship, that bipartisanship that perhaps we sometimes long for. It's hard to say whether we'll ever come back from that and find a time when we're able to have that bipartisanship again. I'm sure it will happen at some point, but it just seems to be very difficult at this point because we tend to fight over almost everything and don't see that long-term gain.
Dr. Gao, the strategic approach and visionary thinking has always been important in whichever state we're talking about. If you look at our world's history, particularly contemporary past, Dr. Gao, are we, some wonder, in another important crossroad now, when some of the principles that everybody earlier agreed upon now being debated, at least among some? Dr. Gao, how, once again, the significant life of George H.W. Bush and many of the others of his generation could be of some help for today?
Well, I would say from here in China, over the years and decades, we came to appreciate President George H.W. Bush for being a man and leader of honesty, of decency, of civility, of humility, and of trust. You can disagree with him on certain things, but you can trust him and you can take his words for granted almost. And I think this is the qualities that are lacking in some of the top leaders in the world, or even in Washington today. You cannot turn a country into a country where the leaders can no longer be trusted, or his words cannot no longer be taken at the value of the words, for example. And I think this really set President George H.W. Bush apart from many leaders today. And I think this generation, we need a better leader, a leader like George H.W. Bush, a leader whom we can trust and whom we can count upon. Whether you are an American, for example, or here, whether you are a government official or an ordinary person in China. We do mourn his passing away, and we do want to put on the record that the Chinese people will always keep in good memory of whatever President George H.W. did in promoting friendship and goodwill between the Chinese people and the American people.
Certainly our condolences going to the family members of George H.W. Bush, but certainly his life, together with many others of his generation, are lives to be celebrated eventually. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for being with us and helping us understand the importance of it. Victor Gao Zhikai, Michael Johns, and Tim Sekeyo. Thank you so much for being with us.